Webinar started. People are entering. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's seminar on Humpback Whale Ecology off New Jersey. We're going to get started in just a moment. Please hang tight. All right, we're looking good. I'm going to hit record and kick us off. Oh, somebody already hit record, it looks like, right? Oh, thank you, Amy or Steve, for hitting record. All right, we're ready to rock. All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Doug Zemeckis, an extension agent with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Tonight is number 6 of 6 of our spring webinar series, coined the Elements of Natural Resource Management. This is part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension, where we provide science-based educational programming. This is part of our Earth Day Everyday program, which is a collaboration with our Marine Extension Program Seminar Series MEPS, with a team of extension agents with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Joining me tonight, co-hosting Dr. Steve Yerjo and Dr. Amy Rowe, part of our larger team on this Earth Day Everyday program to cover a mixture of terrestrial and marine topics. This spring, we're focusing in on the elements of natural resource management. We covered water, air, fire, and also tonight with the spirit element, we have Danielle Brown from Rutgers University speaking to us about humpback whale ecology off New York and New Jersey. Some navigational aids for tonight's webinar. We're scheduled for about 1 hour together. I'll be serving as the host and also the moderator. If you have any questions for Danielle, please put them in the Q&A feature in this Zoom webinar. I'll organize them and pitch them to her at the end, moderating the Q&A period, and we'll get through as many questions as we can. This seminar is an educational program providing science-based educational information with Danielle, an expert on humpback whale ecology. We strive to keep this as a respectful, constructive arena for learning this science-based information. I'll be going through the Q&A and pitching those that are appropriate, and as many as we have, to Danielle to learn more about humpback whales. Next slide, please, Danielle. At the end of Danielle's presentation, just before the Q&A, one of my colleagues is going to pitch, and a poll will appear on your screen. This poll is a program evaluation to get your feedback on tonight's seminar and to hear about what you learned and your feedback on tonight's program. So that way we can also improve future programs and seminars through Earth Day Every Day and other programs that we work on through Rutgers Cooperative Extension. As part of that poll, given the nature of the questions, it's considered research to get your feedback on this webinar. It's considered research by our institutional review board. The first question will be to get your consent to participate in that short evaluation survey that'll appear on your screen at the end. Next slide, please, Danielle. And Rutgers Cooperative Extension, we are an equal opportunity employer and program provider, and providing programs such as this Earth Day Everyday program without discrimination and to as wide of audience as possible. Tonight's webinar, we have it live, but also a recording. And we're going to put the recording up on our Rutgers NJAES, New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, YouTube page to make it as widely available as possible through these online outlets. Next slide, please, Danielle. With that, I'd like to formally welcome and thank Danielle Brown for joining us this evening, making the time to prepare a presentation on urban humpback whales off New Jersey and New York. Danielle is a PhD candidate in the Ecology and Evolution program here at Rutgers University. She's also the Director of Research for Gotham Whale. She's got a bachelor's degree in biology from Stockton University, a master's in environmental science and policy from George Mason University, and her many different roles with Gotham Whale and years of experience studying the humpback whale and others off New Jersey waters. She also serves as the curator of the humpback whale catalog that we'll be learning about, I think, tonight. She's been studying humpback whale ecology and published multiple papers on this subject. So real expert, local scientist working on the amazing humpback whale population we have here off New Jersey and New York. Thank you again, Danielle. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to your talk, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. You did a fantastic job introducing me, so I'm not even going to go through most of this, but hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. The only things that Doug didn't mention is that I'm a Jersey girl. I've lived here my whole life. I actually have a bachelor's degree from Stockton from way back when. And in addition to my work as the director of research for Gotham Whale and a PhD candidate, I also work as a naturalist on a whale watching boat, which essentially means that I am out on the water with whales up to 7 days a week, multiple times a day. So I see them a lot. So now I just want to orient everybody with our study area. Some of you may be from here, but some may be from outside the area. So the New York Bight is this triangular body of water between Montauk, New York, which is up here, and Cape May, New Jersey, which is down here. It's part of the U.S. Mid-Atlantic, and there are two major estuaries located within the New York Bight. We have the New York, New Jersey Harbor Estuary at the northwest, and then we have the Delaware Estuary at the southwest. Now, the U.S. Mid-Atlantic is generally from New Jersey south to North Carolina, and it is part of the Greater Atlantic region and the Western North Atlantic. So you'll hear me use those terms quite a bit today. When I refer to the U.S. Mid-Atlantic, I'm referring to this area between the New York Bight and North Carolina. And then the Western North Atlantic includes the Gulf of Maine, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and Newfoundland, and other parts of Eastern Canada. And let's introduce our study species. So what is a humpback whale? Their scientific name is Megaptera novangelae, which essentially means big-winged New Englander. Big wing referring to their unique pectoral flippers that you can see here in the photos, and New Englander because they are very common off of New England. They are a migratory baleen whale, which means that they do not have teeth. They filter feed through baleen plates. They're found in all oceans of the world, but they can grow up to 60 feet long. They can live more than 80 years. And what's really cool about humpback whales is that they have these unique fluke patterns. I have an example below, but this enables us to actually identify them at the individual level. And I'll explain why that's important later on. So the current status of humpback whales is that they were removed from the endangered species list. Even though they were hunted for centuries in the North Atlantic, there was a ban in the US on humpback whaling in 1955, and this was much earlier than some other species. We also had the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act that were both enacted in the 1970s. And then the global whaling ban in the 1980s. So humpback whales appear to be recovering, and the population that breeds in what we call the West Indies in the Caribbean includes most whales from the Western North Atlantic. That population has found to be increasing, and so they were removed from the endangered species list. But that does not mean that they do not have protections. All whales are still federally protected everywhere they are. So before we talk about humpback whales in the New York Bight specifically, I think it's important to discuss the North Atlantic. I'll give you some insight into humpback whales in the entire North Atlantic and then kind of narrow it down to our region. So in the North Atlantic, humpback whales have primary feeding grounds and wintering grounds that they migrate between. They're generally on these primary feeding grounds during spring, summer, and fall. And then January, February, March, they're most likely on these wintering grounds. So the North Atlantic has 5, the Gulf of Maine, Eastern Canada, West Greenland, Iceland, and then the Eastern North Atlantic, which you can see in the red in the figure. The wintering grounds are in green. There are 2. We have the West Indies, which I mentioned, and then the Cape Verde Islands. Now, the whales that are closest to us here in the New York Bight, they mainly feed in the Gulf of Maine and Eastern Canada, and these whales primarily use the Caribbean feeding ground. So what we know about their migratory routes is that migration typically takes place further offshore. These are whales that were satellite tagged on the West Indies breeding ground, and you can actually see the tracks that they took to their respective feeding grounds. Like I mentioned, the Gulf of Maine and Eastern Canada, you can see that migratory path between those feeding areas. And then you can see that whales that feed in Eastern Canada and Iceland, they have a much longer migration. So they do usually have a shorter feeding season as well, because it takes them longer to get there. The whales from the eastern North Atlantic are the ones that seem to use the Cape Verde Islands breeding ground more often, but eastern North Atlantic whales are also found in the West Indies. So basically all of this means that studying humpback whales is relatively complicated, especially knowing that they use potentially more than one breeding ground. They use multiple feeding grounds, and each one of these feeding grounds is actually a distinct population. So what defines a primary feeding ground, we call them primary feeding grounds, is that these are areas that humpback whales consistently return to year after year. And this is based on maternal site fidelity. So mother humpback whales bring their calves back to the same feeding ground. And then when they wean and become juveniles, they typically do also return to the same feeding ground that their mother brought them to. And this makes each one of these feeding grounds genetically unique from each other. There's not a whole lot of movement between them. Oh, and I also want to note before I forget is that 90% of these photos that I'm showing here were taken within the New York Bight. So because the Gulf of Maine feeding ground is the closest one to us, and also where we know many of our whales belong to, I'm going to use this as an example to describe the characteristics of the feeding ground. So in the Gulf of Maine, whales are most common from April through October, but there are smaller numbers of whales seen outside of this timing. Even in the winter time, although most of the whales will be down in the West Indies during the winter. Those that do stick around are usually juveniles or adult females. Their distribution on these feeding grounds is strongly related to prey availability. So there has to be prey there to keep the whales there. If there's less prey inshore for a certain period of time, you'll see whales moving more offshore. And if there seems to be a higher availability of prey in a southern area, then you'd expect to see more whales in those southern regions. Now, their most common prey species on the primary feeding grounds are a fish called an American sand lance and also Atlantic herring. But they're also known to feed on Atlantic mackerel. Up off of Eastern Canada, capelin is another small fish that's a very common prey species. But they are generalist feeders. So they will feed on whatever prey is most available to them, and they really look for these schools, like high densities of fish. That being said, they do occasionally feed on krill. Krill has been found in the stomachs of humpback whales, and also some other unusual prey species like cyanids. So for example, weakfish or Atlantic croaker have actually been found to be eaten by humpback whales. And their feeding behavior differs based on prey. So for example, here I have a photo of humpback whales bubble net feeding. What they do is they bubble net feed on sand lance. They're swimming underneath them and the bubbles drive them up to the surface. So this is a very common behavior that is seen in the Gulf of Maine. So now let's go a little wider. Let's talk about humpback whales in the U.S. mid-Atlantic. So there's limited information on humpback whale presence in the mid-Atlantic states prior to the 1980s. But we do know that at some point between 1985 or after 1985, sightings of juveniles increased, notably off the Virginia area during the wintertime. And during this time, there was also an increase in humpback whale strandings from New Jersey to Florida. And I have actually a map of those strandings all the way to the right. Now, most of these strandings did occur in Virginia and North Carolina, mainly during fall, winter, and spring. And these were juveniles that were tied to the Gulf of Maine feeding ground, although there were a few that belonged to the Eastern Canada feeding ground as well, but mostly from the Gulf of Maine. And during this event, we did see evidence of ship strikes and entanglements. So since that time, we found that juveniles feed consistently off the Virginia Beach area every winter. So that's still being documented today. And we also know that beginning in the 2000s, there was a more southern distribution of humpback whales from the Gulf of Maine extending down along the continental shelf edge into the New York Bight. So if you look at these figures here, this, I hope you can see my mouse, the one in the middle. This is the distribution of humpback whales between 1978 and 1980 by abundance surveys. And then all the way to the right, you have the present day distribution. And you can see that there's been quite a few different sightings of humpback whales, much further south than where they were back in from 1978 to 1980. And this figure down here is it's showing the distribution of humpback whale sightings off of Virginia Beach outside the Chesapeake Bay area. So we had this increase in juvenile humpback whales along the U.S. mid-Atlantic, right? So keep that in mind. So now, from 2010 to the present in the Mid-Atlantic, we know that there was another increase in humpback whale strandings from Maine to Florida. Okay, this more recent event is larger than the previous event from 1985 to 2000. We know that an unusual mortality event was declared in 2016, but strandings of humpback whales actually began to increase quite a bit earlier than that. This is just when they chose to declare the UME. There are many similarities to that previous event from 1985 to 2000. We are also seeing mainly juveniles from the Gulf of Maine stranding. We're still seeing high numbers in Virginia and North Carolina, and we're still seeing that evidence of ship strike and entanglement. But what's different in this recent event compared to the previous one is that there are high numbers in New York and New Jersey too. And now these strandings are taking place year round. Okay, so keeping all that in mind, let's talk a bit about humpback whales more locally. So, similar to the rest of the U.S. Mid-Atlantic, there is not a lot of historic information on humpback whales, but we do know that right whales and fin whales are very common in the New York Bight region, especially right whales because we know they were hunted here, so they were common. There's very few records of any humpback whale sightings or strandings near shore historically. And most historic books either don't mention humpback whales at all, or if they are mentioned, they say that they were uncommon. In the lower right here, this is actually an excerpt from a newspaper from 1843, and it's one of the few that actually mentions a humpback whale, but they were known to be uncommon in the region. Now, a research study that took place towards the end of the 1970s found humpback whales to occur in the New York Bight, but in small numbers. But there was wide variation. So in some years, they found quite a few of them, and then there were some years when they didn't see them at all. But when they did see them, it was mainly during the summertime, with some sightings during winter. These sightings were mainly off eastern Long Island. You can see the map up here. So these are showing where the highest number of sightings were of humpback whales. But they did occasionally move into New York Harbor, even back then. So you can see there's a little bit of a density here inside the New York Harbor area. Now, it's worth noting that this particular study did not survey the Jersey Shore. We actually did not have surveys off the Jersey Shore area back then, but humpback whales were still making the news back then. So this is an article from 1988 of a humpback whale sighted inside Shark River Inlet, which is in itself interesting. So from beginning in the 1990s, we did start to see humpback whales seen by whale watching boats. These whale watching boats were in Montauk, in Cape May. We also had companies popping up in the central Jersey Shore area, in Brielle, in Highlands. But Montauk and Cape May sightings took place mainly in the summertime, and then in the central Jersey Shore area, they were whale watching during the winter. January, February, March was actually their most common timing for going out and seeing whales. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there was an increase in sightings and strandings along the Jersey Shore during this time. So New Jersey was affected. Not as many as were in Virginia and North Carolina back then, but we did have a few strandings of humpback whales. This article in the upper right is actually from September 2001. So this was in Belmar. So strandings did take place back then. But after 2000, sightings from whale watching boats began to decline. A few of these whale watching companies actually did end up closing up shop because the sightings just weren't happening the way that they had been. So from 2008 to 2009, we had the first systematic surveys for whales off southern New Jersey, from Barnegat Inlet south to the Cape May area. They only found 17 humpback whale sightings in 2 years, which is kind of surprising when you think about, how we see humpback whales today. They were also mainly seen during the winter and in spring. And what's also interesting is that there were no sightings really close to shore. So our humpback whale sightings are the circles. So most of them are, I think the closest one is about 5 miles or so offshore, but most of them are much further off than that. Again, super interesting when you think that today we're seeing them from the beaches. So from 2011 to the present, we have quite a different picture here for the New York Bight. We've had increases in humpback whale sightings from whale watching boats near New York City and Montauk. We've also seen an increase in feeding inside the New York, New Jersey Harbor estuary, which is where New York Harbor is located, but also we have many different shipping lanes and shipping channels going through these areas. They are now one of the most common species seen in the area, and they're seen both near shore and offshore. So what we've learned so far from these animals is that they are common along the shores of Long Island and from New York City south to Barnegat Inlet. They very often do feed still inside the New York, New Jersey Harbor estuary. And you can see the large number of sightings in that region in the lower right. They occasionally travel up into New York Harbor and also even the Hudson and the East Rivers, which are heavily trafficked areas. So that is concerning. Now, what we know about humpback whales in the region almost exclusively comes from the regions you see on the right. Okay, so from the New York Bight area, New York waters, and just the northern portion of the Jersey Shore. And that's because that's where most of this effort takes place. So this is two different types of effort we're looking at. In the upper right, this is effort from whale watching boats. And then in the lower right, this is effort from aerial surveys that were more systematic. So from both of these data types, we know that humpback whales are here year-round, even in winter, but much less in winter. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about humpback whales south of Barnegat Inlet to just about the southern portion of New Jersey. But Whale watching data from the Cape May area does suggest that humpback whales are most common in the spring and then in the fall. There is limited research since 2009 that has taken place along New Jersey, but hopefully you're all aware that that is going to change. So a significant amount of work and effort is being put into learning more about whales off of southern New Jersey. So what we've learned from the research that is out there is that near shore whales, the humpback whales we see are almost exclusively juveniles. So when we say juveniles, we're saying less than 5 years old. 5 years old is the youngest age that a humpback whale has ever had a calf. But actually, we now know that it's much longer. Actually, it's closer to almost 12 years old now that they're having their calves, and less than 36 feet long. We've learned through photographic matching of humpback whale tail flukes with other areas that most of these whales are from the Gulf of Maine, similar to the sightings that were found off Virginia back in the 1990s. About 50% of our whales are seen more than once in a year, which is similar to primary feeding grounds, right? They do show some kind of site fidelity, and they do return in consecutive years, but it seems that it's only an average of 2 years. So we're not seeing that consistent annual return like they do on primary feeding grounds. Usually inshore, you're seeing either single humpback whales or possibly doubles swimming together, but you're not seeing large groups. And also mother and calf pairs are rare. So that brings up the question, why are they here? And I'll get to that in a minute. They do feed on Atlantic menhaden inshore, and we know that from photographs of feeding events. We actually see the fish jumping out of the water, so we can identify them. But we also know they're feeding on other fish species. So Atlantic menhaden are not the only prey species they're feeding on. They feed below the surface too. And near shore, juveniles exhibit a feeding behavior called lunge feeding, which I'll show you in a second. I do have a video. Now, offshore, we see a little bit of a different picture. We see both juveniles and adults further offshore. So if you look in the upper right, this is a figure from Stepanek et al. That is showing you distance from shore and the proportion of adults to juveniles. So adults are the green. So you can see, 0 to 20 kilometers offshore, their study didn't find any adults. They didn't see any adults until 20 kilometers from shore. And the number of adults increased the further off that they went, and the number of juveniles decreased. We know that these offshore adults are also typically from the Gulf of Maine. But we don't know much about their site fidelity. So to date, there haven't been many studies looking at how long they stay around or if the same individuals are coming back offshore. We do know that they tend to feed on American sand lance, and that bubble feeding, here's our bubble feeding photo again. This is seen off the coast of New York and New Jersey, but much further offshore, because that's where they're feeding on sand lance, where they're known to bubble feed on. We also see larger groups offshore. They do tend to even feed in aggregations with other species like fin whales and minke whales further off. And mother-calf pairs are occasionally seen out there, but still not often, not as often as they are on those primary feeding grounds. And again, there's that question of why are they here if their mothers aren't bringing them here? So I promised a video of lunge feeding. Before I show it to you, I'm just going to talk about how lunge feeding is a risky behavior. So when juvenile humpback whales lunge feed, they are highly unpredictable. They're coming up out of the water through a school of Atlantic menhaden. This is not a typical feeding behavior that they see on the primary feeding grounds. They do see some lunge feeding, but it's usually a slower lunge feed, and it's usually in these very large groups. It's a little easier to predict because you're seeing bubbles come up first. So we don't see that very often here. And over on the right, this map here is showing you locations of where lunge feeding actually took place. So it takes place all throughout the region, but inside the New York, New Jersey Harbor estuary and inside the convergence of a few shipping channels. So here, let's watch our video. Hopefully it works.
My phone to take pictures of everyone.
So that's lunge feeding, and that was actually a little bit slower. It can happen slow or it can happen very fast, but you really didn't expect it until the last minute. And it's very possible that this may be a driving factor in why we're seeing some of these juveniles stranding in the mid-Atlantic region. If this is the behavior that they're exhibiting most often when they're feeding, and it is so unpredictable, you can imagine that it may be unsafe when there are ships in the area. So as far as why they are here, I know nobody likes to hear this answer, but the truth is we really don't know at this point. We're still learning. The presence of juveniles near shore, we know, is influenced by prey, right? Just like it is on the feeding grounds. So it does explain why we're seeing younger animals closer to shore, because there's a prey source there. But this doesn't explain the increase in adults that's been taking place offshore. It's more likely that the increasing numbers of humpback whales near shore is related to more using the entire mid-Atlantic region, and they're just working their way in. Remember, these northern feeding grounds are changing. The ocean temperatures are increasing dramatically, and you can see that in the map in the lower right. The darker areas of red are where we're seeing anomalies in sea surface temperature. This is affecting the prey species, so it's most likely affecting the whales too. So this change that we're seeing with more whales using the mid-Atlantic, with more whales using the New York bite, it's most likely going to continue. So the question is, how can we best coexist with these humpback whales as they continue to use our area and potentially increase? I work with Gotham Whale, which I mentioned is a nonprofit organization that collects data from whale watching boats and also from the general public. We call them our citizen scientists. We do manage the largest humpback whale catalog in the region. We have collected more than 3,000 sightings of 360 individuals. And this all began in 2011, so it really has not been very long. And with our catalog of individual humpback whale flukes, we collaborate with local organizations to see where these whales have been before, but also figure out how long individuals are staying in the area, whether they do return in consecutive years, and also where they're feeding. And we share sightings with managers who are making these decisions on how our waterways are used. So that being said, there are risks to humpback whales in our area that we need to be prepared for to better manage them if they do continue to increase. It's a fact that humpback whales are hit by vessels in the New York Bight. It does happen. We've seen both old and fresh injuries out on the water. What's important to understand is that recreational vessels can cause injuries to whales, even if they're small. There's a common misconception that just because a vessel's small, a whale's not going to get hurt if it happens to get bumped or hit. But that's not the case. You can see here in the lower left that is a propeller injury that was most likely caused by a small propeller from a recreational vessel. These whales are highly unpredictable. They can cause injury to both humans and also can damage your boat. But it's important to know that humans are not always at fault here, okay? I know there's a stigma right now about always thinking that humans are the problem. In some cases they are, but not all cases. These whales are incredibly unpredictable. They are very young and very inexperienced. But that's why we need to be the ones looking out for them, making sure we know where they are at all times. Now, commercial ships, they can cause mortality to a humpback whale, even if it's going slow. You're talking about a very large, very heavy ship that cannot stop quickly. So they can cause serious damage, even if they're only going 11 or 12 knots. The container vessel traffic leading into the port of New York and New Jersey and also into the port of Virginia has increased over time. This is a study that just came out in the last 2 weeks. Over all the way to the right, you can see the total container traffic. On top here, we have the port of New York and New Jersey, and then down here we have the port of Virginia. And you can see how much that shipping traffic has increased. These shaded areas are the unusual mortality event that just was declared in 2016. So look at that increase in container traffic that happened during this time. So these areas where we're seeing this increase in container traffic are the same areas where these juvenile humpback whales are spending a lot of their time. And this is a dangerous combination. Now, unfortunately, sometimes humans are at fault with what happens with our humpback whales here. We have documented cases of harassment, and it's been happening for quite a while. This article over on the right, up top, is from 1993. This was a humpback whale off of Ocean City, and somebody was getting too close and was chasing it. On the lower right, we see that happening even more recently. Jet skiers tend to circle whales, they'll chase after them. So humpback whales are federally protected, even though they're no longer considered endangered. Harassment is directly approaching a whale within 100 feet, chasing a whale to get a photo, or doing anything to change their behavior or stop them from doing what they're doing. So if they stop feeding and come over to you, you might feel like it's a positive interaction, but that's still considered harassment because that whale was feeding and you stopped it. Or if it was resting and it changes its behavior. Whales need rest, whales need food. So any disruption can prevent them from doing these things. Entanglements also occur here. Humpback whales have been entangled in all 4 of these gear types off of New York and New Jersey. And all of these types of gear can cause damage. Even down here, you see this is a fishing lure and monofilament line that's hanging off of a whale. That can slice right through their skin, just like it can cut through our skin. So just because it's monofilament and it's thin doesn't mean it can't hurt a big whale. And unfortunately, trash is still a problem. Not just balloons, but plastic. We still see lots and lots of plastic floating out there. Plastic breaks into smaller pieces of plastic, which affects us too. So what can we do to better coexist with our humpback whales? If you're out on the water, never stop looking for them. Know that they can pop up out of nowhere, and you may not have seen them from a distance first. They're small whales, only 25 to 35 feet long, and they have a small spout. It's not easy to see. They're not feeding in those big bubbles like they see on primary feeding grounds. If you do want to watch the whales, that's okay. Just watch them from a distance. Make sure you're giving them extra space and backing off if they get swamped by a lot of boats. And I highly recommend taking the boater education course by seeaspout.org. They offer it for free. If you are fishing in the area, there's inevitably going to be whales at some point. Reel in your lines if they get too close. If a whale's near you, don't just leave that line hanging out there because 1, you might lose your rod if it does get caught on a whale, and also they can get caught by that monofilament. And if you see anything floating buoys, floating gear, report it to the Coast Guard. Think about reducing plastic rather than recycling. I know, reduce, reuse, recycle. We always focus on the recycling portion, but this is not a good answer. Only not even 10% actually of our recycling actually gets recycled. That's a very low percentage. So the best thing to do is to reuse as much as possible and don't have that whole garbage can full of recycling that you're putting out once or twice a week. Okay, try to lower the amount of plastic that you use. Don't use balloons. If you do, please pop them, throw them out. Don't let them get released. Even if it's by accident, they're going to end up in the ocean. Okay. We've seen balloons floating as far as 120 miles offshore. And of course, pick up trash whenever you can. And then one really important way that you can help is to help with research. Share your whale sightings to an organization like Gotham Whale. About 25% of our sightings come from citizen scientists, just like you guys. They're very important. I can't tell you how many times where there was a whale that we hadn't seen in a few years, and all of a sudden a citizen scientist out on his recreational boat snapped a photo and sent it to us. And we said, oh, well, there's that guy, he's back. So you can always go to our website and submit sightings. We, again, share them with managers. This is how we learn about their distribution. This is how we can better protect them in our region. You can also, of course, follow on social media. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our contributors to Gotham Whale. These are local whale watching companies that you can come aboard. The season has started, so definitely get out there and see whales if you've never seen one. We'd also like to thank our citizen scientists who have contributed over the years. And for more information, these are just a few links that you can visit to learn more about the research that is going on in the New York Bight region. Thanks.
Awesome. Really great work, Danielle. I learned a lot. That was super interesting about the ecology and migration, life history, and stressors humpback whales are experiencing here, and some very valuable tips on and off the water for people to improve or reduce our interactions with humpback whales in many different ways. We do have some really excellent questions in the chat too, in the Q&A. If people have them, you can put them in the Q&A. I'll pitch them to Danielle. We can learn even more from her during this Q&A session. So first one I'll throw at you, Danielle. Jody was wondering, when bubble feeding, are there whales doing the work, so to speak, exhaling the bubbles while others feed on what is being brought to the surface? Kind of like a team approach, it sounds like she's asking.
Yes. So they do take turns. So you would have a whale releasing these small bubbles, and it's in a spiral. I know it kind of looks like it's a circle, but it's actually spiraling down. And then one will create the bubbles while others will feed through. So they do cooperate. It's really cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. Back just before the lunge feeding video, Kathleen asked, does this mean that humpback whale feeding on fishes like menhaden, that those fishes are breeding more now than in the past, in the 80s or 90s as an example?
That's a great question. So Atlantic menhaden are, they're an important prey species to our region, but they were also heavily overfished for a long time. So there have been protections put in place to for them to increase in abundance, which is great. But they're also a somewhat more southern species. So Atlantic menhaden were thought to be migratory through our region, and we're only really here during certain times of the year. But we now know Atlantic menhaden are staying year round, and their center of their distribution has moved further north as the waters have warmed up.
Cool. Thanks, Danielle. I'm sorry if you were distracted there, but everybody, the polling just questionnaire just appeared in the popped up on your screen probably. Thank you, Steve. Please take a few moments while you listen to Danielle in the Q&A to provide your feedback on tonight's seminar. Another biological question from Kathleen. So the juveniles, mostly males and under 5 years old, she indicates, believe you mentioned, are they being pushed out of their pods and having to figure out how to feed on themselves? So they're coming closer to shore?
So not just males. We're seeing both males and females. That was actually a theory for a while, that these were juvenile males just kind of running amok from the rest of the population. But no, we're seeing both males and females. And not being pushed out. They actually only wean for about the first 10 months of their year, and they separate from their mothers before the end of their first year. So these are animals that we're seeing that have recently separated. We do see animals that are as young as only 2 years old, but we also see older ones. And what's interesting is that this is just a small number of juveniles we're seeing here. So most of the other juvenile humpback whales are still up north. They feed with the rest of the population. They feed with the adults. We're just seeing some here. So no, I would not say being pushed out from the population. We're not really sure where they're coming from.
I'll take the liberty to ask a question on mine. Is NOAA or others doing increased aerial surveys throughout the whole Northeast, including off New Jersey?
They are, yes. One of the reasons is because whales appear to have been increasing. There's been a lot of interest, right? So yes, NOAA has actually extended some of their aerial surveys further south, and during the winter time, which is great because we really don't have many boats on the water during that time. So we need that information.
Awesome. One more biological from Captain Paul, wondering if you could talk about the heavy rainfall impact on plankton this spring, as we had a really slow start, bunker-wise, that is.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Preyfish species do not like fresh water, right? So we do tend to actually see when there is a lot of rain that the fish are affected. We'll see the Atlantic menhaden in particular move further offshore, away from where that
Ooh. Danielle just paused for me. Was it Danielle or me, Steve or Amy? Can you hear me?
the estuaries, and we'll see plankton blooms. That does happen. But the water is typically warmer during that time. So in cooler waters, like in the spring, if that fresh water is coming in, it's actually going to push the fish away.
Cool. Thanks, Danielle. Sorry if my internet or yours hiccup there. I got you back now. My apologies if that was me or you to the viewers. Grace Ann's wondering, on average, how far can a dead whale travel from the impact location to where a body might wash up stranding on the beach? In other words, can a whale die in New York Harbor and body wash up down the Jersey Shore?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question too. Now keep in mind, it depends on the currents, right? It depends on where the whale is actually killed or whatever happens to it. They can travel 50 to 100 miles in just a few days. So think about like a message in a bottle, right? So you can toss that off and it could be just a few miles from shore and never hit land at all. It can travel quite a distance in a short period of time. So it's very similar with anything that's floating, including a whale. Also, what makes it somewhat more difficult is that whales tend to sink first and then pop up later after that they filled with gas, right? So they could refloat a few days later. It could be a few hours later. It does depend, but absolutely, a whale could be hit and killed in the shipping channels and float anywhere along the Jersey Shore.
And actually, in the deep ocean ecology, way out deep, whale deaths and large animals sinking to the bottom play a really important role in the ecology when you get to the deep abyss as well. I don't know, just side note. Hillary's wondering what organizations in New York and New Jersey are authorized to work on disentangling whales if one is encountered.
That's a great question. So at this point, we do not have an organization that can respond to disentanglement. The closest organizations are in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and also down south, I think in Virginia. So those are the closest ones right now. However, we do have folks who are trained in the region to attach what's called the locator buoy. So when an animal is found to be entangled, someone can respond as soon as possible and attach a GPS locator on the gear. And hopefully we can track the whale until the teams are able to come down. Now, that is something that is of interest in the region. So there are talks about having a team down here. I know that there are some local organizations that have equipment to make it easier for when the teams come down from those other areas. But currently there is no organization authorized to do it at this point.
Right on. Thanks, Danielle. somewhat related, Jody asked, what agencies are involved when a dead whale washes up or is seen on the water, not necessarily entangled?
Agencies that respond, it could be anybody can go out. I shouldn't say anybody, but the U.S. Coast Guard, the NJDEP, they can go out and document the whale. But as far as actually responding to it and bringing the whale to shore, conducting necropsy in New Jersey, the Marine Mammal Stranding Center is the only authorized organization, and in New York, the Atlantic Marine Conservation Society is the only authorized organization. So both of these nonprofits have the permits to respond.
Gotcha. And Stanislav was wondering, you mentioned sometimes when, or maybe always, I don't know, when the whale dies, does it always sink and then pop out back up, or sometimes do they just float at the surface? And if so, what might feed on dead whales?
Okay, so there, as far as the do they all sink or do they all float? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I know that at some point they all float. I don't know if at some point they all sink first. That I'm not sure about. As far as what might eat them, we have a large variety of shark activity off of New York and New Jersey. There are many different species that would feed on a deceased whale.
Well, thanks, Danielle. We had a few questions, as you might expect, given the major issues with offshore wind off New Jersey. Do you have any knowledge on any of the latest science on how humpback whales might be impacted by the potential future offshore wind development?
So I know pretty much the same that you guys probably already know, that the installation of the wind turbines involves something called pile driving, which does make a loud sound. Now, pile driving is something that has taken place in other oceans for other activities, not just the installation of wind turbines. And what they found is that whales will typically avoid the sounds of the pile driving. So they do hear it from a distance, and they tend to just avoid or move away from these areas, which is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to better understand the timing of when these whales are here, especially highly endangered species like North Atlantic right whales. We really need to understand what times they're here and what times they're not, so we can better prepare for something like that would cause noise.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Danielle, for your response to that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of focus on the death of them here in strikes.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay.
A big part of what you work on. So Steve threw the link in the chat again about see the spout for people to report information. But Stanislav also was wondering, do all boat operators need to have specific training regarding whale encounters? He's referring to small boats, personal boats.
So there currently is no specific training required. It is recommended. Now, until recently, it wasn't something that was heavily advertised in the New York and New Jersey area because we weren't really known to be a whale dense area. But these programs are heavily advertised up off of Cape Cod, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. There is no requirement. It is just highly, highly recommended.
You mentioned there was a training, Steve.
The seaspoutvwatchout.org actually does have a free boater education. You can also look into things like Whale Sense. Whale Sense is a program that promotes responsible whale watching guidelines. That's another place you can look.
Great. Bill's wondering, because of the bulbous bows on many freighters, how much of a problem are whales being hit or caught up on those bulbous bows of ship that are coming from around the world into New York, New Jersey harbor?
So the bulbous bows in particular are not the problem. The issue is that when a vessel is moving at a specific speed, and it's a very long vessel. So picture a vessel 1,000 feet long, right? Their propellers are near the stern or the back of the vessel. And also the engines are typically located further towards the stern. That's where the sound of that ship is coming from. Okay, so whether the ship has a bulbous bow or not, If it's coming towards a whale, the whale doesn't really understand or know where that sound is coming from, especially since there are likely other vessels in the area too making sounds. So that's really the issue, is that they don't know what's coming towards them. It's not specifically the bulbous bow itself. It's just that the shape of that bulbous bow is what will push the whale up onto it after it's been hit, but it doesn't necessarily have much to do with the hitting of the humpback whales. Although I will say that there's a theory that North Atlantic right whales, when they sense danger, they actually float below the surface. So that's when they're likely to get hit by that bulbous bow, because they're actually hovering below the surface, because they think they're protecting themselves. Don't know where the sound is coming from, hear it, and then hover below, and the bulbous bow can come up.
Jody's wondering what can be done on a larger scale with the shipping issues and strikes. I understand that even a slow ship can cause harm, as you're noting, but is there legislation that states ships need to slow down? Is there research on what speed of a ship that a whale can then avoid it?
Sure. So the research that's been done suggests that the faster that a large ship is going than 10 knots, the more and more likely that a whale is likely to be killed if it gets hit. So there are speed restrictions in place outside the New York Harbor area, outside the Delaware Bay area from November through April to protect North Atlantic right whales specifically. Now, that's something that's important. So there are no speed restrictions in place from May through October. Okay, so we're not talking about the timing of when humpback whales are here. We're talking about North Atlantic right whales. So they've instituted a speed restriction of 10 knots or less for vessels over 65 feet. The reason why they came up with that number is, like I just said, that seems to be like, for lack of a better word, the sweet spot where vessels at 10 knots or less, even if they do happen to hit one, because it can happen, the whales are unpredictable. If they happen to hit a whale, the whale is less likely to suffer mortality and may just be injured and be okay. The higher you go from 10 knots, the higher the likelihood that it will suffer a mortality.
Oh, thank you. There is some pending regulation on that, right? For
the pending regulation is just to extend that to the end of May. Oh, and also to smaller vessels as well.
I'll cast one more question at you related to offshore wind and whales. See if you have any knowledge. I know you mentioned the acoustics and sound are not your expertise, but do you have anything to share about the potential impacts of the acoustic surveys that wind developers are doing to characterize the bottom for their future development? Are those surveys having any impacts on humpback whales' abilities to detect ships?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I know there's been a lot of concern and a lot of interest in whether or not the geophysical surveys were related to any of the strandings that have taken place. I highly recommend reading the study by Thorne and Wiley 2024. It is available for public access, so you don't have to pay for it. It's open access. They are actually the first ones to look at the timing of when the geophysical surveys took place since 2016. And the years, they compared it to the years when strandings were high up and down the Atlantic coast. And what they found was that during years when strandings were very high, they actually weren't doing any geophysical surveys. So for example, in the early part of the study, in the early part of the unusual mortality event, strandings were highest in Virginia, North Carolina. There were no geophysical surveys taking place in those areas. They were actually only taking place up in Massachusetts, I believe, at the time. So there's no relationship between those surveys and the strandings. And I know that off of New Jersey, 2019 was actually the year that had the highest number of strandings, and we did not have any geophysical surveys taking place off New Jersey during that time. But that's all I know, and I know from what I've read. So yeah, I highly recommend looking into that study as well.
Thanks, Danielle. We have about 4 or 5 more I'll cast at you, and then
Yeah.
they'll covered a lot of great ground here. Impressive with the breadth of your knowledge on these. You're ready for your PhD defense, hopefully coming up soon. You've talked about it there in some comments. Obviously, we've had this unusual mortality event. Any other hypotheses of what might be causing it? You think your slides might have alluded to it, but what are some of the leading hypotheses right now?
Well, I mean, what makes the most sense to me is that if there are more whales in an area, there will be more strandings regardless. An example could be, I like to use the example of deer feeding along a highway, right? If there's no deer, you're not going to see deer getting hit by cars on a highway, right? So an increase in deer in an area that is heavily trafficked, you'd expect to see more impacts with cars or more interactions with cars. It's very similar with these whales. So more whales in an area, even if vessel activity stays exactly the same, I would still expect there to be an increase in strandings because there's more whales moving around the ocean, there's more whales close to shore, and there's more whales feeding with that lunge feeding behavior. So knowing that there has been an increase in whale sightings in New York and New Jersey, in the rest of the mid-Atlantic, and also an increase in container vessel traffic, to me, that is the theory that both together are causing the unusual mortality event. And they suggested the same thing back in the 1985 to 2000 events, that they were seeing an increase in these younger, inexperienced whales closer to shore and with swimming in and around vessel traffic. And something that is also important to know is that there's a common misconception that whales will move out of the way or they're afraid of boats. They don't want to be near them. That's actually not true at all. We see it on the whale watching boats every single day. Humpback whales seem to either be interested or curious about vessels that are in the area, or they're just completely ambivalent and they just continue what they're doing, whether there's a huge cargo ship nearby or a small recreational vessel. They don't care and they don't react, which is a problem.
Very interesting. Thank you, Danielle. Does your organization or any others alert the shipping industry when there are sightings and whales in the area?
So Gotham Whale does contribute some sightings to an app called Whale Alert, which is available to the maritime community. We do contribute sightings when they're in or near the shipping lanes. I myself have personally called the Coast Guard to let them know when there is a whale feeding inside a shipping lane or a shipping channel, because they do have a tendency to do that, which can be scary. There are also many other organizations that are involved in passive acoustic monitoring that they directly alert organizations like NOAA, for example. If a North Atlantic right whale is detected, they will alert them. And that way they can send an alert out to mariners and issue maybe a temporary voluntary speed restriction, which actually has taken place recently. We're finding that North Atlantic right whales are still here in the area when it's unusual for them to be here this time of year. So as soon as they're detected by these passive acoustic buoys, an alert goes out. So the first link that I shared at the end of my presentation, robots for whales, you can actually go on yourself and you can see what species have been detected.
Cool. That's Mark Baumgartner's group at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, right? The link is going in the chat now, so people can check it out. Cool. I'll cast 3 more at you, Danielle. Is fishing pressure in any way a contributing factor to the increase of humpback whales and them moving closer to shore?
Fishing pressures. So that's a really good question. Now, it depends. So humpback whales are very opportunistic. They will eat whatever prey species is available. So they're able to prey switch, and we've actually seen that happen. So in the Gulf of Maine, for example, in years when there was a lower abundance of sand lance, they moved a little bit further offshore to a different area to feed on Atlantic herring. So I don't know that fishing pressure affects them in our region as much as it does in other regions. So in areas where they fish heavily for Atlantic herring, for example, up north, that could definitely affect the humpback whales. Here, offshore, they're most often feeding on American sandlance, from what we see from visual observations, and there's no fishery for sandlance here. But the reason why they are feeding on sandlance could be because of a decline in herring. So everything's related, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think we saw the midwater fishery for herring and mackerel off New Jersey really in the last 8 years or so, 9 years. Cool. Two more. Margaret's wondering, could you speak to the number of years that a female whale generally will breed over the course of her lifetime?
The number of years, they don't have a calf every year. Usually it's every, I believe, 2 to 3 years that they'll have a calf, which is why sometimes there are adult females seen during the wintertime on the feeding grounds, because these were females that were either pregnant or between breeding years. If you're referring to how long in their life that they can have calves, I actually don't know. I know menopause has been documented in other in toothed whale species. I don't know that it's been documented for in baleen whales, but that would be super interesting.
Cool. All right. Wow. Well, really test you there with the whole wide range, and an easier one maybe for you to answer, but one of probably great interest now that everybody learns so much about humpback whales here. They might be excited to go out and see them. So when is the best time to take visitors whale watching in New Jersey?
So whale watching is spring, summer, fall, depending on what area of New Jersey that you would like to be. So some companies run longer than others. I work for a company, Jersey Shore Whale Watch in Belmar, and we typically run from May through early December. But I know that other companies down in Cape May, for example, some of those guys will run from March through December. So they have a longer season. But best time, I would say, is between June and November is the best time. And we do see them a lot throughout that time. They're not passing through, they do stay around, which is really exciting to see.
Wow. Yeah, fantastic opportunity that we haven't had in quite a while here for people to connect with nature and humpback whales and provide local industry as well. So thank you very much, Danielle. A great talk, and also really productive Q&A period. Learned a great deal from that as well across the board there. Impressive breadth of knowledge. And thank you to all the other speakers. I don't know if any of them were with us tonight, but we had 6 great seminars this spring as part of the Elements of Natural Resource Management for our Earth Day Everyday program. Thanks to those who filled out the poll to provide feedback tonight and your participation. A lot of common names who participated last multiple seminars with us. All the recordings from the past are up or will soon be up on our Earth Day Everyday program website and the Rutgers NJES YouTube page. So check it out, share with your friends so that way they can learn more. And stay tuned for more from our Earth Day Everyday program either this fall or maybe some more educational programs, opportunities to this program in the summer. Keep an eye out. You all have been added to the listserv as you've registered for these. So appreciate your participation and more great stuff ahead. Recognize and thank Steve Furjo, Amy Rowe with us tonight on our organizing team from the Earth Day Everyday program. We also have Sal, Michelle, and Jean, other extension agents. So more coming at you soon. Thank you very much for the interest, participation, and commitment. Be well, and see you all next time.
Thank you.